So I'm not sure the reason for the question about my location while taking that picture of Maughold Lighthouse, what the motivation for that question is, but it may have something to do with the angle from which the lighthouse is being viewed. So this is the particular location, as I've shown in the slides already, and it is slightly further round to the east than the viewpoint from the cliff top. Now, if we zoom in on Maughold Lighthouse, you should be able to see that the base structure, which is just to the side of the lighthouse, is in my photograph that can clearly be seen to the left of, slightly to the left of the main tower. And the bottom line here, I know they cross a little bit, but the bottom line here is the view from Egremont Road, and the top line here is the view from the cliff top at St Bees. I hope you can see that actually from the cliff top at St Bees, you ought to be able to see rather more of this base structure protruding to the left. The further to the north that you view this from, the more to the left of the main tower this base structure will appear, until here from almost due north you would actually be able to see the small gap between them. The further east you go, the more in line with each other they get, until if you were viewing from a point almost exactly due east, slightly south of due east, they would be in a direct line with each other, and you might find it very difficult to make that observation and that distinction. So if that was the motivation behind the question, hopefully that clarifies what we would expect to see from the two different viewpoints. So the reason that I think it's perfectly possible that you could see the Maughold Lighthouse from lower elevations is, well, it's simple geometry and mathematics, really. We know that the distance to the Maughold Lighthouse is 50.8 kilometers, give or take a few meters. And we have a location at St Bees where the wind turbine footage that I used was filmed, which we know to be around 12.25, maybe 12.5 meters above the sea level on that day at that time, which was near high tide at that time. And this is around about 40 feet for those of you who work in imperial measurements, and about 31 miles if you work in imperial. Now, at high tide from that location, we have a refracted hidden height of 93.62 meters. And the Maughold Lighthouse is 65 meters above mean sea level, and so perhaps around about 61 or 62 meters above the actual water level at the time. And so we would not expect to be able to see the Maughold Lighthouse under those conditions. It would be 30 meters or so below the horizon, and it would take quite exceptional refraction conditions to get the light above the horizon. However, this was at high tide, and we know that the tides can vary quite considerably this has gone back to current date. Oh, that's not a bad one to use as an example. Okay, so the high tide here is, I think, above 9 meters by the look of it. 8.9 meters the high tide there. Okay, nearly 9 meters. And low tide is down at just 0.34 meters. There we go, 0.34 meters. So 8.5 meters difference between high tide and low tide. And these tide tables only work on the gravitational effects on the tide. They're not actual recordings of tide heights. They are predictions based on the location of the moon and the sun relative to the Earth and what tide would be expected. And they give you a measure. Sometimes the tides are very extreme, like this, and sometimes the tides are far less extreme, like on the 10th of March. It's not going to be much difference going from 6 meters or so down to just under 3 meters or so. So only a 3 meter difference or thereabouts. Well, we can have as much as a 9 meter difference in the gravitational tide, and if weather conditions are appropriate, that can be even more extreme. So we can have different atmospheric pressure and wind directions and so on, having quite a significant bearing on the tide and the actual tide achieved. So it's not unreasonable to say, well, we could be even 10 meters different higher in our elevation at low tide than I was on that occasion when it was I was 12.25 meters above the water. So if we put in, well, let's go to 10 meter difference. We now have a 71.5 meter refracted hidden height. But we've also changed our elevation, the elevation of the lighthouse, because the lighthouse is also at low tide and would be at least around another 5 meters higher above the water level than it is the height given, which is above mean sea level. So we assume mean sea level is kind of halfway between our high tide and low tide point. Then we can imagine that the lighthouse, or not imagine, we can say that the lighthouse would be at 70 meters rather than 65 meters above the level of the water. And so 71 meters, 71.5 meters and 70 meters is not, they're not very far apart. And this is allowing for what's kind of called a standard refraction. It's a measure of something that might be expected under supposedly standard conditions. Well, standard conditions almost never occur. The amount of refraction is always either going to be greater than this or less than this. So if on a day in question we have a low tide and we have more than the standard refraction conditions, then we'd expect to be able to see the light from the lighthouse. Under high tide conditions, it would take exceptional refraction for the lighthouse to be visible, and under the sort of normal low tide conditions with increased refraction but not crazily exceptional, you'd also expect the lighthouse to be seen. Bear in mind also that this is an approximation, this calculation. It is based upon a perfectly spherical Earth with a radius of 6,371 kilometers. And the Earth is not a perfect sphere. It is not even a perfect ellipsoid or spheroid. It is a slightly irregular spheroid or geoid. And so any calculation that is based on a perfect sphere will have a margin of error and not necessarily give a perfectly accurate figure. So as long as we're in the right ballpark with our refracted hidden height to be able to see our observation, then we can say that it is in keeping with what we would expect to see on a spheroid Earth. Another point to make is there's a big difference between seeing the lamp of the lighthouse, as I've shown in the videos that I've earlier in this video and other videos, and seeing a glow from a lighthouse on the horizon. And mariners are well well familiarized with seeing the glow of a lighthouse. And just I was hunting around for some sort of example. I wanted a good picture, but couldn't find one quickly. But I did find this book, which is a book about motorboating on the ocean. And it says in this book that it's talking about lighthouses and how you predict the time of landfall, and saying it's generally best to make landfall at night if you are approaching a major lighthouse. You can see a light much farther than you can see the lighthouse in the daytime, and it talks a little bit about heights and distances and so on and so on and so on. But most importantly here it says you may see the loom or glow. I'll just scroll this up. Here we go. A few miles further, then you can see the bright light itself. When you do see the light itself rather than the loom, it says lower your head a foot or so. If the light can be blanked out by the horizon as you bob, so bobbing up and down, you are near the distance found in the previous paragraph, which is the distance that they're talking about here for your distance, calculating your distance to the horizon and the lighthouse. So this glow is a well-known and often talked about thing amongst mariners, and so you can see the glow before you can see the lamp, and therefore if the lamp itself might be hidden below the horizon, you may still see this bright glow coming just above the horizon, and it will do it with the same rhythmic flashing as the lamp itself, but you're not actually seeing the lamp. And that could easily be verified by moving the elevation of the camera a few feet higher, at which point you ought to be able to then see the lamp and see that it is quite clearly different. So the question of whether we ought to be able to see Maughold Lighthouse from these lower elevations is explained. Now the question is, what observations can be made? My own observations, I have only seen the lighthouse from the high point on the cliff, so from an elevation some 10 meters higher or more than this elevation. I could not see it from lower elevations, but having said that, the tide conditions will have had an effect, as would the refraction conditions applying at the time. And I'd be perfectly happy. You ought to be able to see it if you go to maybe 25 meters elevation, and this is not something that I tried. The lighthouse would then be, even at mid-tide, would then be just about visible. My observations are you need to be quite high up on the cliffs to see the lighthouse under normal circumstances. But at low tide, with some refraction, no reason why it shouldn't be seen. And so if you get the occasional observation of the lighthouse flashing from those elevations, that's fine. If you can show that you can see the lighthouse all the time from that low elevation at night, then well, we have something to talk about, but your observation contradicts my own observations.